Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rogier. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here once again for the final installment of the Legacy program. We've been doing this since the end of middle of September, and it's been a wonderful uh, trajectory of just us learning and listening and kind of just digging deeper into the history and the story of religious dissent or the story of dissent, period, in African American communities and in the larger world that affects African American communities. This is a production of Black Non-Believers and also of the American Humanist Association, AHA. And Black Nonbelievers is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in the Atlanta area. We connect with other Blacks and allies who are living free of religion and might otherwise be shunned by family and friends in a caring, friendly, and informative environment. Instead of accepting dogma, we determine truth and morality through reason and evidence. We have a mission, which is primarily to provide secular fellowship, to nurture and support non-believers in coming out and openly identifying, to promote pride in atheist or non-religious identity, to organize members for charitable causes and a variety of events. And we welcome as a group everyone. Black non-believers welcomes all people regardless of age, gender identity, sexual identity, national origin, and or racial identity. Mandisa is not here today. She's out of town, and so it's up to me to do some of the honors. I'm just going to briefly share with you my screen. Here are some links in social media that you can use to follow and subscribe to Black Non-Believers. We're on Facebook as Black Non-Believers, Instagram at Black Non-Believers Inc., Twitter at B Non-Believers, and YouTube as Black Non-Believers Inc. You can also donate and support Black Non-Believers at the website, which is blacknonbelievers.org, where you can make recurring contributions. There are options available for whatever you may wish to donate. Those donations go to supporting the organization and for programs just like this. We also have available for those means donations that can be made through Cashapp, foundation giving requests. We're also on Amazon Smile. There is an option for a stock transfer at TD Ameritrade or a workplace charitable giving program. Um, Coming up, we have a few things going on. We have the 10th anniversary celebration, which is going to be January 15th through the 17th, and that's going to be in New Orleans. As currently stands, this is on schedule, and there has been a vigorous sort of check of the facility and the location where this is going to be. And we're expecting to be able to carry on as planned in New Orleans on this weekend. If you are unable or unwilling to make out the trip, given the current pandemic status, there will be an option to participate via streaming link, and so there's going to be options that are made available for streaming as well. Also, in the corner, you will see that there is the Women of Color Conference, Women of Color Non-Belief Conference, which is going to be happening also next year in September, September 24th through the 26th in Chicago. And there's also the BNC Con, which happens in November. That has been rescheduled due to that. This year's cruise has been rescheduled due to the pandemic, but will be shipping out next fall in November of 2021. So these are all some of our or highlighted events that are coming up next year. We're really excited about, especially the 10th anniversary in January in New Orleans. We've been around for 10 years. BNDC has been around for about since 2014. So, for those of you all who are familiar with where we are, we've been around since 2014, and it's a pleasure to be an affiliate of the overall national organization. All right. Let's go ahead and make our introductions. Some of you all may remember from the last time we featured Dr. Christopher Cameron in the first series of the Black Nonbelievers, of the Legacy program. So I just want to kind of give a proper introduction to him again for anybody who did not or wasn't able to attend. Um, Christopher Cameron is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He's a fellow with the American Council of Learned Society, excuse me, founder of the African American Intellectual History Society, and the author of To Plead Our Own Cause: African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement. He's also a co-editor of the New Perspectives on the in, of the excuse me, New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, and he is joining us for the second time. The book that he is going to be talking about today is Black Freethinkers. All right, this is the book here, and some of you all will find that in the link. And just in general, I just wanted to read a quote before I introduce him and have him take over. He says, I think the primary reason that Black freethinkers have been ignored is the politics of respectability prevalent among scholars in African American history. This field began in the mid 19th century as a way to highlight the achievements, patriotism, and contributions of African Americans to the nation. Black history was, and sometimes still is, a political project aimed at making an argument for racial equality. If African Americans could be presented in a positive light, so the thinking went, they would be given equal rights. Thus, many scholars tended to dismiss, downplay, or ignore anything that presented the race negatively. And so, with that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Cameron, who's going to give us a little bit more into this history of Black freethinkers, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the first part of the book. Thank you so much for joining us once again, Dr. Cameron.
Yeah, thank you for that generous introduction and for the wonderful work that you do with BlackNonbelievers D.C. I'm really happy to be here with you all again. For the first talk in this series, I primarily focused on the fourth chapter of Black Freethinkers, and I talked about the intersections between secularism and the civil rights and Black power movements of the 1960s and early 1970s. I'll talk about that a little bit towards the tail end, but I'll focus on it quite a bit less than I did that day, so I can give you more of a general overview of the long history of Black free thought spanning about 175 years from the early 19th century up through the Black Power movement in the 1970s. I became interested in this project about 8 years ago in 2012. For me, this is sort of a personal and a professional project. So I am a free thinker myself. I am an atheist, and I have been for about 10 years. And probably about a couple of years into my journey as an atheist, you know, it was fairly isolating. I didn't know a lot of other Black atheists or agnostics. So I found myself sort of trying to search for a sense of community and to search for some like-minded people and connect with them on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. And in that sort of search for a Black free thought community, you know, I started to come across BlackNonbelievers, which had been fairly recently created at that point. But I also came across sort of random blog posts, YouTube videos, things like that on individual Black freethinkers. So a lot of the people that kind of show up in my book, I would find, you know, a 1,500 word blog post on one of them, right? Hubert Harrison, for example. Um, so I saw that there was some information out there, and I started to get a sense when I really did some digging that you know, this history was much more widespread. This phenomenon of Black free thought was much more widespread than historical scholarship on African American religion and African American intellectual history would have us believe. Right? I had read deeply in the history of Black religion for my first book, which focused on sort of the intersections of Puritanism and Black abolitionist thought in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I was really familiar with works, especially in early America, on African American religion, yet I had come across really no mentions of atheism or agnosticism among slaves or free Blacks in early America, and very little mention of those groups in the 20th century, even though I was finding they were becoming increasingly widespread during that 20th century. Now, in the quotation that Ro just read, he noted that, one of the things that I found is that among scholars who do African American history, I think this politics of respectability has certainly been one of the factors that's led to sort of an ignoring of the history of Black free thought, at least among scholars, right? But I think there are some other reasons as well, and one is this notion that this long-standing notion, not just among Black scholars, but really among Americans in general, that African Americans are naturally religious, right? That the Black church has always been at the center of the Black community, that it's the most important institution in the community. Um, and it's a belief that, in the course of researching this book, I found has its roots in the 19th century abolitionist movement. So, in his very influential 1835 book entitled Slavery, the Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing noted of Southern slaves that of all the races of men, the African is the mildest and most susceptible of attachment. He loves where the European would hate. He watches the life of a master whom the North American Indian in like circumstances would stab to the heart. The African is affectionate. And the primary reason for this supposedly loving and affectionate nature of African Americans, in Channing's view, was that he said, quote, the colored race are said to be peculiarly susceptible of the religious sentiment. Now, a scholar of Black religion named Curtis Evans notes in his book, The Burden of Black Religion, that both abolitionists in the 19th century and pro slavery thinkers alike appropriated Channing's argument about sort of the primacy of Black religiosity. And this reasoning really reinforced this 19th century view that Blacks are naturally religious, and it's continued to influence perceptions of African American religiosity since that time. And again, whether we're looking at articles by white free thinkers like Eugene MacDonald in The Truth Seeker, whether we're looking at testimony in the U.S. Congress in the 1950s before the House Un-American Activities Committee, whether we're looking in Black popular culture or just American popular culture more broadly, we see this idea again and again coming up of African Americans being overly religious or being naturally religious. And it's something that I think has caused people to not even consider that there might be a long and vibrant tradition of African American free thought. Now, I can't go too in depth into that tradition in the next 35 minutes or so, but I'll try to give you a good sort of overview of the key themes in the history of Black free thought from the early 19th century up through the civil rights movement. So let's start with the origins. I found while I was doing research, especially in slave narratives, in travel accounts to the South, in newspapers from Black activists and abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, as well as just free thought papers like The Truth Seeker. I found in the course of this research that African American free thought arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And we see in these origins a key distinction right from the start, a key distinction between Black and white freethinkers. So if we're looking at the ideology of really well-known white freethinkers like Thomas Paine, right, in the 1790s, or Robert Owen and Francis Wright in the 1820s and 1830s, we can sort of trace their anti-religiosity to Enlightenment philosophy, to Enlightenment science. Some were kind of religious liberals and then moved a bit more on the spectrum towards deism and secularism. But generally, we're looking at, for white freethinkers, the origins of that movement being in religious liberalism and Enlightenment science. But Black free thought grew pretty directly out of the institution of slavery and the conditions that Blacks endured within it, right? So on a day-to-day basis, African Americans embrace free thought because of a sort of inability to resolve the problem of evil, which is sort of incredibly prevalent throughout their daily lives, right? These are people who are witnessing savage beatings and whippings. They're witnessing people being sexually assaulted. They're witnessing their family members, or they're experiencing themselves being sold away at a whim, right? Because their master lost a card game or something like that. And so the idea starts to arise that there cannot be a just and benevolent and all-knowing God who actually loves me and cares about my interests. If there was, then I would not be stuck in this hell of slavery in the United States, right? Um, so slave narratives became especially important for my research. For decades, historians have been using these narratives to document multiple aspects of the Black religious experience. But I found in reading for this probably 15 to 20 or more autobiographies of slaves and formerly enslaved people, I found that these narratives also speak to the presence of atheism within 19th century slave communities. So, one formerly enslaved man, Austin Stewart, for example, immediately after discussing a brutal whipping that his master administered on his sister on a Sabbath morning, he asks in his narrative, "Can anyone wonder that I and other slaves often doubted the sincerity of every white man's religion? Can it be a matter of astonishment that slaves feel that there is no just God for the poor African?" So this is a theme that comes up again and again in both slave narratives and the accounts of travelers to the South. People like Daniel Payne, who would later in the 19th century become a bishop in the AME Church, but in the 1830s, 1840s, he was a teacher and just sort of a regular minister traveling to the South and observing conditions on plantations. And this theme keeps coming up again and again, where you see slaves who are experiencing these brutal punishments, and this is causing them to question the idea of God. And this is sort of helping to spread atheism and secularism on these 19th century plantations. Um, Another key development that sort of fostered the growth of African American atheism was the rise of pro slavery religion. And these are just sort of religious justifications and theological justifications for the institution of slavery. Um, and this is something that would become more of a coherent body of thought among Southern intellectuals and among Southern slaveholders after the 1830s. And it sort of arose and grew strength in large part because of the growing strength of the abolitionist movement in the 1820s and the 1830s, right? So early in the 1830s, on January 1st, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison began to publish his Liberator magazine, a publication that would put out weekly issues for the next 34 years until slavery was abolished in 1865. A couple of years later, the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed in Boston in 1833. We start to see a great sort of flowering institutionally of the abolitionist movement, a proliferation of anti-slavery publications, more people traveling around the country, giving speeches, attacking slavery, writing more books, putting together more petitions. So Southern slaveholders start to feel that their institution is under attack, right? And religious and theological justifications for slavery, right? Drawing off things like the curse of Ham and other biblical texts. These really start to gain strength in the 1830s and 1840s, as well as the type of preaching that is trying to sort of introduce slaves to God, but at the same time keep them in their place. as bondmen and bondwomen in this world, right? So the type of preaching where, slaves are going to church and they have a separate service for them. And they're not necessarily learning all of the kind of theological and religious lessons that their white counterparts would have learned, right? They're going to church and being preached to, and the minister's telling them, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat. So they're basically getting messages that are trying to sort of use religion to strengthen the institution of slavery. So that type of preaching, as well as the increasing proliferation of pro-slavery religion, becomes another sort of key justification and a key factor in helping to spread atheism among 19th century slave communities. Now, aside from the freethinker Frederick Douglass, what we usually see during the era of slavery among many Blacks was not necessarily the type of secular humanism that would be characteristic of white freethinkers, but rather just kind of strict atheism or agnosticism. They were skeptics regarding the existence of God, but because of their positionality as enslaved people, they didn't necessarily have the means to try to help improve the lives of other people. But when we do see some of these individuals like William Wells Brown and Frederick Douglass that are religious skeptics, when we do see them gaining their freedom, they're certainly very active in abolitionist, women's rights, and other kind of political and social causes of their day. So the first chapter of the book talks about these sort of origins during the 19th century. And from there, I move into talking about the era of the Harlem Renaissance, also known as the New Negro Renaissance. And this is where we see sort of a great flowering of Black free thought. And we start to see free thought develop quite a bit. One of the key differences that we see in the 1920s up through the 1940s is that rather than having somebody who wrote a slave narrative comment on other slaves who were atheists or agnostics, right, partially as an argument for why we shouldn't have slavery in the country. During the Harlem Renaissance, you start to see freethinkers, Black freethinkers, that are using their own work to articulate their own ideas rather than just sort of commenting and pointing out the irreligiosity of other Black freethinkers. Now, the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural and intellectual movement that arose in the late 19 teens and early 1920s. And it had its developments, it had its sort of origins in other developments, especially the Great Migration from the South, which saw roughly 1.5 million Black Southerners migrate to the urban North from 1914 up through the end of the 1920s, right? They're moving north, trying to escape racism in the South, but also moving for greater economic opportunities, right? During World War I, a lot of white workers are going into the army and serving in Europe. So Blacks are coming from the South to take their place in factories in Chicago and Detroit and New York City and whatnot. And you also see after the end of World War I, a sort of staunch racial backlash from whites throughout the United States. This is a period, especially that the sort of infamous Red Summer of 1919. This is a period that saw a massive increase in the number of race riots throughout the United States. You would see Black soldiers who had served in Europe in World War I, who had served in part because they thought this would be making an argument for citizenship and for equality when they returned back home, right? If they went to sort of fight to make the world safe for democracy, they're coming back and they're being attacked in their military uniforms when they arrive at train stations all throughout the country. Right. Now, what this backlash does is it doesn't completely do away with sort of traditional political activity and political organizing, but it does cause a number of activists and intellectuals to look for different ways of helping to bring about racial equality in the United States. And so you had some folks like um, Charles Johnson, you had some folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, and others pushing for more kind of cultural approaches to solving racism, right? And arguing that that African Americans can sort of prove their equality, prove their fitness for American citizenship by writing great poetry, by writing the next great American novel, through the theater, right, through artwork and things like this. So the Great Migration of Black Southerners to the North, as well as the sort of racist backlash that we see during the Red Summer of 1919, would help to sort of inaugurate the Harlem Renaissance, one of the sort of greatest flowerings of African American literary and cultural life that we've seen in the United States. And what I found is I was initially introduced to some of the secular leanings of some of these Renaissance writers back, 8 years ago when I was first reading through some blogs and watching short presentations that I found online. And so after I'd seen, a couple of references to like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston being free thinkers, I basically just started to read everything that I could from Harlem Renaissance writers. And what I found is that quite a few of them were actually free thinkers, including Alain Locke, the man widely known as the father of the Harlem Renaissance. Um, James Weldon Johnson, right, author of the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, the poet Claude McKay, and others. Free thought and secular themes are really rife throughout a lot of the sort of literary productions of these writers. Nella Larson is particularly intriguing to me because her work really kind of helped to inaugurate the ties between feminism and free thought, especially her novel Quicksand, which she published in 1928. That novel focuses on Helga Crane, who was widely at the time believed to be modeled off of Larson herself. Um, in the novel, right from the start, it opens up articulating Helga Crane's dissatisfaction with American Christianity, with religion in general, right? In the first couple of pages of the novel, Helga, who is a teacher at a school called Naxos, an anagram of Saxon, down south. This is a Black school that's basically a composite of two schools that Larson herself attended, Fisk University and Tuskegee University. So Naxos is supposed to be sort of representative of one of these Southern HBCUs, right? And in the opening pages of the book, Helga Crane is having to go along with other teachers and students to the school chapel, where she has to listen to a sermon from a traveling white minister, right? And the minister is basically saying, you Naxos Negroes, you are better than other Blacks throughout the country, right? And it's because you guys are not sort of agitating things politically, right? You're not trying to sort of rile up race relations and things like that. You Blacks at Naxos, you know your place. That's why I like you guys, right? So Helga Crane is really mortified, and she would end up leaving Naxos fairly soon. She would travel to Chicago, which is actually where Larson herself grew up. Um, and she's a newcomer in Chicago. So she thinks, all right, well, I'll be able to meet some people at this Black church. I think it was like a Presbyterian or Black Methodist church, something like that. She thought she'd be able to meet some people, maybe get some help finding a job, whatnot. And she was basically snubbed, right? So in the first couple of chapters, right, she's gotten this patronizing sermon from a white minister. She cannot find any sense of community among Black Christians in Chicago. And then later on in the book, after a number of different experiences, traveling to Europe, coming back, to Harlem, where a lot of folks from the South were migrating during this great migration. She would end up making a really rash decision in sort of a moment where she was spurned by a former lover. She had like stumbled on accident into this storefront church in Harlem. She would make a rash decision to marry a revival preacher named the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green. Moved down to Alabama, and within 3 years, she had four children, one kid, a set of twins. And then after the fourth children, she's basically sitting there on her deathbed. Um, and she realized that she had completely ruined her life in converting to Christianity, in marrying the reverend, right? Because these are seen as this is just what you do, right? You convert, you become a Christian, you get married, you have kids, you live this sort of normal or heteronormal life. And she's sitting in bed after having this fourth child, not knowing whether she's even going to live. And Larson writes of Helga, with the obscuring curtain of religion rent, she was able to look about her and see with shocked eyes this thing she had done to herself. She couldn't even blame God for it now that she knew he didn't exist, right? So because of her experiences in marrying the reverend, she eventually came to disbelieve in God, right? She had been very skeptical in the earlier part of the novel. Now she becomes an atheist towards the end, and she really rejects the sort of normative family structures. She rejects the influence of patriarchy in Black communities, and she really kind of ties in religion with patriarchy as something that is oppressing women, right? That is causing her to sort of sink into this quicksand, right? So I say she kind of inaugurated the ties between feminism and free thought, in that by sort of linking religion with patriarchy, with heteronormativity. She's saying this is something that oppresses women, and for women to have true equality in this country, they need to sort of slough off belief in God. We see similar themes in the work of Zora Neale Hurston, right, and some of her anthropological work, as well as, ironically enough, Their Eyes Were Watching God, right, which is also sort of a kind of a feminist novel. Um, I was most interested in doing my research on Hurston in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, which she published in 1943. And probably more than any other Harlem Renaissance thinker, she really kind of clearly lays out her problems with religion. Now, Hurston had grown up in Eatonville, Florida. She was the daughter of a Baptist minister in Eatonville. So, she grew up in the church, but she writes in her autobiography that she was questioning religion from a very young age. Um, and she had questions about sort of God's omniscience and God's power, but she sort of stifled these questions because she felt that they would sort of harm her efforts at building community, harm her efforts at making friends, that she would be sort of looked at as a pariah. That's another theme that comes up, is that some people are really hesitant to be open about their religious beliefs while they're young or while they're in their sort of smaller Southern communities. And this is one of the reasons why the Harlem Renaissance becomes such a formative moment in the history of Black free thought, because you have people like Zora Neale Hurston, who had grown up in Eatonville, couldn't really be as open about her beliefs there. You have folks like Langston Hughes growing up in Joplin, Missouri, same situation, right? He comes to disbelieve in God around 13, 14 years old, but it's not something that he can really be open and vocal about where he is in his small community out in Joplin. But when all of these intellectuals and creative types, artists and writers, when they're finally coming together in Harlem in the early 1920s, and they're going to Columbia University like Langston Hughes did and Zora Neale Hurston did. They're taking classes from freethinkers like Franz Boas, with whom Hurston worked in her anthropology degree. And they're now able to be more open and more vocal about their religious skepticism, right? I came across some evidence while doing research on A. Philip Randolph, a sort of socialist freethinker, that while most blacks in Harlem were going to church on Sunday morning, a lot of black freethinkers would gather in A. Philip Randolph's room, and they would sort of debate and talk about politics and economics and their problems with theology and their issues with the church, and how to sort of build a vibrant socialist and labor movement during the early 1920s. So it's sort of like an anti-church gathering in A. Philip Randolph's living room every Sunday morning through the afternoon. But they're now able to sort of build community and be with each other and share some of their ideas and refine some of their ideas. So free thought secularism would become pretty widespread throughout writers and thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance. But at the same time, you had a number of Black radical thinkers who were not afraid of engaging in sort of traditional overt politics, who didn't really care about the white backlash, who really embraced kind of traditional and even more radical political opportunities during the 19 teens up through the 1930s. So the third chapter of the book focuses on the ties between Black free thought and Black socialists and communists during roughly a 25-year stretch from 1910 up through 1935. There are a number of prominent sort of Black communist intellectuals and activists during this time period. Louise Thompson Patterson was one. She was married to a prominent Black lawyer named William Patterson. He was a lawyer for the NAACP. Hubert Harrison was sort of a towering Black intellectual of this time period. Harry Haywood was sort of the leading Black communist in the sort of mid 1920s on. He was likewise a Black freethinker, as were some names that are probably more familiar to a lot of people, like W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Richard Wright. Now, the socialists and communists were appealing to Black intellectuals and to Black political activists for a number of reasons, right? At least ideologically, they downplayed issues of race in favor of economics, right? So as long as you were a part of the working class, at least in theory, then you could be a part of these movements. Whereas you would see the Democratic and Republican parties specifically trying to sort of speak to racial issues and to sort of animate racial divisions and tensions in order to gain more adherence and to win office, right? Socialists and communists kind of downplayed those. Communists as well seem to sort of show up more for African Americans. So, for example, when the Scottsboro Boys in 1932, this is a group of 9 young African American men who were falsely accused of raping a white woman. When they were arrested and put on trial, the Communist Party was right there, sort of front and center, helping to fund their legal defense, helping to send their mothers and parents on speaking tours to sort of drum up funds for their defense as well. These sort of political ideologies became increasingly appealing to African Americans, and also the socialists and communists were generally non-religious or even actively anti-religious, right? So in 1926, the Communist International, which is sort of like the governing body for world communism, put out a directive that said, we expect communists around the world to be atheists. And it was really the case that at most communist meetings, at least in the northern United States, they were highly critical of religion. If you were known to be a church goer or a church member, you could face discipline or expulsion from the Communist Party. So for individuals who may have been who may have been religious skeptics before becoming socialists or communists, you can see why these parties would have been attractive to them in their sort of anti-religiosity. And then for some, it was sort of the other way around, where they sort of joined up with socialists and communists for kind of political reasons and economic reasons, and then kind of adopted the secular perspective of those parties. Um, Socialism and communism would really sort of go hand in hand with secularism, right? And socialists and communists, like especially Hubert Harrison and Louise Thompson Patterson, would be highly critical of the ties between capitalism and Christianity. This is sort of a key theme that we see in the speeches and in the writings of Black communist freethinkers, right? That capitalism and Christianity work hand in hand to oppress Black people, not only in the United States, but throughout the globe, right? A lot of prominent Black communist and socialist freethinkers were not homegrown African Americans. Many migrated from the Caribbean, for example. Hubert Harrison was one of those. W.A. Domingo was another one. Richard B. Moore was a really prominent Black socialist and freethinker who had likewise migrated from the Caribbean. So they're sort of expanding their critique beyond African Americans and showing how capitalism and Christianity work to not only oppress Blacks within the United States, but are also sort of the twin evils that are helping to reinforce the oppression of Black people in the Caribbean and throughout Africa, right? They argued that capitalism and Christianity really played a central role in colonialism by European nations within or on the African continent. So that third chapter really looks, like I said, at this period from the 19 teens up through the 1930s and the early 1940s, ending with some of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who over his long life would would go from being a socialist probably from the 1890s up through the 1930s or so. And then he would sort of move more towards communism from the 1930s towards the end of his life. So we see Du Bois kind of growing increasingly radical over the course of his life. And for him, like Hubert Harrison and other Black socialist and communist thinkers, he sort of made the same critique, both in the pages of The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP that he edited, as well as his autobiography and even unpublished letters. He would make these same critiques that he thought capitalism and Christianity were sort of the two main reasons why African Americans and African peoples more broadly remained oppressed throughout the globe. And so I'll end for my last 10 minutes or so talking about what I really focused on quite a bit more in that first talk, namely Black free thought during the civil rights era. Now, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is often portrayed as a religious movement. And that portrayal has its grounding in a lot of truth, right? It certainly is the case that churches were important meeting spaces for activists. It's certainly the case that Black religious figures were sort of front and center in a lot of civil rights protests. But that doesn't mean that it was exclusively a religious movement or even overwhelmingly a religious movement. And I think when we kind of combine the civil rights and Black power movements into one sort of overall Black freedom struggle, we can actually see the influence of secularism to a much greater extent than scholars and even popular culture has led us to believe. So one of the key civil rights organizations that emerged in 1961 was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And, like the NAACP or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC sort of initially was led by Christian activists such as John Lewis, who were highly committed to the philosophy of nonviolence. But really, within a couple of years, the philosophy and approach of SNCC would start to change. And this was especially the case after James Forman and Stokely Carmichael rose to prominence within SNCC. So Foreman had grown up in rural Mississippi. He served time in the military. He attended college in Chicago. He had had sort of a dramatic kind of anti-conversion experience when he was 12 years old. And this is another theme that we see kind of recurring throughout the writings of Black freethinkers, especially Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Langston Hughes. So he writes in his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, that when he was 12 years old, he was visiting his grandmother, attending her Baptist church, and there was a revival service right there. He's up on the mourner's bench with some of the other some of his young friends. And his friends shouted out that they had gotten religion, right? Older people shouted out that they had gotten religion too. Um, and he writes that at the age of 12, I didn't have the courage to tell my grandmother that I thought this was all nonsense. So he looked around, he saw what was happening, he saw like what people were doing when they were saying they were converted. And he said, I too could fabricate some tears in this emotionally charged atmosphere. So I covered my face with my handkerchief and cried, Lord, have mercy. It worked. I was taken off the mourner's bench, and the people talked of how many children got saved that day by the grace of the Lord. Now, he kind of highlights this moment as foundational in his non-belief, whereas, of course, it was supposed to be the moment where he accepted Jesus into his heart and became a born-again Christian. And his atheist perspectives would develop after studying philosophy at Wilson Junior College in Chicago, and he would bring this secular perspective to his civil rights activity. He became the executive secretary of SNCC in 1963 and would ground his activism in secular humanism, largely because he believed that Christianity was a prime reason that African Americans were in a subordinate position in the United States. And he writes very clearly in his autobiography that he feels religion has hurt his people, right? He feels that Black religion, especially, was too otherworldly, and that it caused people to look to God to solve problems and not necessarily to organize and become politically engaged themselves, right? Um, Now, in 1966, James Forman, along with Stokely Carmichael, would lead the transition of SNCC from a religious to a secular organization, and they would help to inaugurate the Black Power movement. And the main goals of that movement were promoting Black economic advancement, pride in Black culture, independent Black political action, and armed self-reliance, or a rejection of nonviolence. Now, Carmichael isn't necessarily placed usually in the kind of pantheon of Black freethinkers, the few that we might generally have known about. But nevertheless, he was an atheist, and he developed his atheism at a fairly young age. Um, Carmichael, like a lot of other Black radicals, especially in the 20s and 30s, was an immigrant from Trinidad, but he had grown up in the Bronx. He lived in the Bronx since the time he was 10 years old. And he ended up attending the prestigious Bronx High School of Science, where he befriended a kid named Gene Dennis, whose father worked in the Communist Party. Carmichael began attending meetings of the Young Communist League, and he quickly embraced atheism. So he was someone who came to communism for political purposes, but then started to sort of embrace their religious skepticism and their atheism. And like James Forman, this is a perspective that he would kind of bring to his civil rights work and his work as one of the founders of the Black Power movement in the 1960s and in ensuing decades. Now, the main institutional expression of Black Power, which is an ideology or a sort of set of ideas, but the main institutional expression of this ideology would be the Black Panther Party. This is a secular organization founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Um, Major sort of programs of the Black Panther Party included health clinics, free breakfast for children. They also embraced the focus on armed self-defense of advocates of Black power. But they also started sort of job training, funds for legal defense, and basically things to sort of empower African Americans, right? To put the ideology of Black power into practice on the ground. And many prominent leaders, as well as rank and file members of the Black Panther Party, including Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, David Hilliard, and Eldridge Cleaver, were sort of very outspoken in their atheism. Like earlier thinkers, they saw the church as conservative, and they advanced a humanist politics that rejected the authority of what they termed derisively Uncle Tom bootlicking preachers. Now, along with the Black Panther Party, we see a sort of a renewed literary and intellectual movement during this period that sort of drew from Black power. And this was known as the Black Arts Movement, which lasted roughly a decade from the mid 1960s through the mid 1970s. And like the earlier Harlem Renaissance, a lot of writers and thinkers of the Black Arts Movement would likewise embrace free thought, including James Baldwin, right, who would explore secular themes and anti-religious themes in multiple works, including The Fire Next Time, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and Go Tell It on the Mountain. And these sort of really demonstrate strongly the influence of his own personal rejection of Christianity. Along with Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry was another important writer of the Black Arts Movement and somebody whose secularism sort of heavily influenced her literature. And so what we see among these writers of the Black Arts Movement is they're not sort of writers who just happen to be atheists, right? But they're writers whose atheism really strongly influences what they choose to write about, right? In Blues for Mr. Charlie, for example, James Baldwin really kind of goes in on the strong ties that he sees between racism and Christianity, as well as in looking at Black religiosity. He like has one of the characters really strongly critique this sort of otherworldly tendencies in Black religion, as well as the tendencies from his perspective of African Americans to basically forgive their enemies and to forgive racists for what they've done to Black people, right? Um, so, generally speaking, from the 19th century up through the end of the civil rights movement, we see that Black freethinkers have been much more numerous than we're probably ever led to believe in any class or educational setting that we might have been in. These were some of the key intellectuals and political activists and artists and writers within African American history, people at sort of the forefront of shaping Black culture, of shaping Black institutions, political life, and political organizations. And their own political ideology, their own literary productions, and cultural work was highly shaped by their secular perspectives, showing us that free thought and secularism has been a much more prominent and important part of African American cultural and political life than we've ever been led to believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That's great. That's so great. I never tire of hearing about the people who've come before us and who've done what you just said, shaping Black culture and politics and activism, and who have left us this legacy, right, with which we can explore and examine and revisit um, pretty much at any time. There's so much to chew from, or to bite off. Where can we talk a little bit about your sources? I think I've heard you talk about, how accessible some of these things are. Certainly, the plays that Lorraine Hansberry plays, and the books that Richard Wright and some of the folks who are a little bit more well known,
Yep.
we know we can find those. But what was it like for you to access, going back to the beginning of your talk when you talked about the slave narratives and the travel, I guess, literature that you found? Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, sure. Those are pretty highly accessible documents and sources as well. So, nearly all of the slave narratives, or probably all of them, you can find on this site, documenting the American South, which is it's put out by UNC Chapel Hill. Um, and it just contains a wealth of books and other publications from Southerners, white and black, from the early 19th century, for really most of the 19th century. So pretty much, if a slave narrative was published, it's on documenting the American South, right? And you can sort of search by region. You can, so, you can have different ways of kind of searching through those. So I just kind of started going through some that I knew, right? And then just randomly searching through and finding other ones there. Um, so that was really helpful, as well as like issues of the truth seeker, which aren't super accessible unless you have a university account or something like that. But still, research that, if you do have some kind of academic credentials or know somebody who does, you can do that type of research from your living room, right? And I think actually now, Roderick Bradford has digitized, or has sort of made available, a lot of the older issues of the Truth Seeker. So you can kind of go through and look at, from the 1870s up through the 1890s, what were free thinkers talking about. That was really important for me when I was trying to get a sense of kind of racial divides among free thinkers. And I mean, you see some white free thinkers who are highly supportive of racial equality and the civil rights movement in the late 19th century. And then you see some Southern white free thinkers who are openly supporting lynchings and stuff like that. So there's kind of a sharp divide among free thinkers about racial issues, and about whether or not race is something that free thinkers should even be considering, right? Should even be talking about.
Wow.
Yeah.
So people were concerned as to whether or not people should even include race in free thought even back then.
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because there's this idea that that moving outside of issues like separation of church and state, teaching of the Bible in schools, evolution, right? That once free thinkers move beyond those issues, they're sort of diluting the strength and the purity of their movement, right? You're taking attention away from free thought. So, what does race have to do with free thought? In order to be a free thinker, you just have to not believe in God, right? You don't have to be some advocate for racial justice. Unfortunately, that view is still widely held among a lot of people today, right?
Yeah.
But in the Truth Seeker, you can see the kind of origins of those debates.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. Let's go to some questions in the chat. Everybody, this is the portion where we get a chance to talk a little bit with the author. Um, let's see what we have here. If we do have anything. Uh, there's a question from Robert. He says, in your experience, what tends to be the reaction of theists upon learning that some of the most celebrated blacks were non-believers?
Um, kind of, I get a lot of expressions of, oh, I didn't really know that. That's really interesting. But sometimes I get sort of skepticism about whether or not they were actually free thinkers, right? I thought that, well, yeah, maybe they were atheists then, but they probably converted on their deathbed or something like that. Um, so some are generally interested and just didn't really know, but I've certainly encountered some of the skepticism about these historical figures, as well as skepticism about my own non-belief. Like, you can't really be an atheist, can you? I mean, like, what is the meaning of life if you're an atheist? So that's probably the most interesting reaction I think I get, is just this non-belief that non-belief is actually a thing among Black people.
That's interesting. It makes me think that it goes back to that link you were talking about earlier with respectability, and how coming out of the abolitionist movement that there was a sense that you know respectability, or we should be identified um, as wholly religious on all counts. And so in order to sell abolitionism, that was sort of the narrative that we needed to adopt. And maybe people have internalized that, and they're like, oh no,
Yeah.
you
Absolutely. And I mean, I think this respectability is actually one of the large reasons why we actually have evidence of atheism in slave communities, because a lot of these writers who are talking about the rise of atheism on plantations, they weren't personally atheists, right?
right,
They were just sort of pointing out this phenomenon, and they were
right.
saying, a lot of the slaves on this plantation just gamble, get drunk, and fight on Sundays, and they curse the idea of God. But they're using that as an argument for abolition. They're saying, look at what slavery is doing to these people, not to me.
Wow,
I'm a good Black person, right?
wow.
But these other people are sort of degenerate, and they're drunks and they're gamblers because of slavery. So it's like, yeah, this respectability politics is one of the reasons why this actually becomes a theme in slave narratives, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
They're pointing out this history because, or this sort of phenomenon, because they think it will make an effective argument for abolition among both white and Black abolitionists.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Can you talk a little bit about Red Summer? You mentioned moving along into the Harlem Renaissance, that Red Summer was one of the sort of it was one of the things that precipitated the migration, the Great Migration from the South, and that when people got to and situated in the North, and specifically in Harlem, then they felt a little bit more comfortable with being able to kind of I guess, kind of shed some things that they felt, um, they couldn't express when they
Yeah.
were in their homes.
So the Red Summer of 1919 had its roots in a few different developments. One was just um, a, a sort of tiredness with agitation of all sorts, right? It's the end of World War One, and people are just tired of the sort of political agitation, white people, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then there's also a very staunch anti-communism that we see arising in the United States right around that same time. The Russian Revolution had just happened. I think it started in 1917,
17.
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're just coming off of the Russian Revolution happening, and there's a sense that um, there for a lot of whites in the United States, there's sort of a tie between sort of anti-racist agitation and communist infiltration, right? It's
Okay.
also a period where we see rising immigration to the United States. So there's just fear of the influence of communists and anarchists from Europe sort of ties together with this sort of opposition to Black agitation and Black political organizing. So that's why I think you see such a staunch backlash to African Americans and to sort of African Americans' political activity during that time period. So, yeah, like I said, for some, the backlash and the racial violence caused folks like Richard B. Moore and W.A. Domingo and others, these Caribbean immigrants to the United States, it caused them to form organizations like the African Blood Brotherhood,
Right.
which is a Black communist organization comprised of a lot of freethinkers who were kind of, they actually were sort of forerunners of the Black Panther Party in that they were training their members in self-defense tactics and in shooting and things like that. So it causes some to go that route, but then
Mhm.
for a lot more people, I think it caused them to go the route of cultural politics and emphasizing literary production and artistic production as a way of kind of more implicitly combating racism rather than sort of openly doing it through organization.
Wow. And you mentioned in the book that a lot of the Caribbean immigrants, W.A. Domingo, and I'm not sure about Hubert Harrison, but the other person that you mentioned, um, maybe Richard B. Moore. You mentioned something about them being having been active politically and organized in their own, where they came from in the islands in Jamaica and Trinidad, people who fought in the First World War or people who were already activated, where they were from, and then so
Yeah,
when they came to the States, they just sort of kind of transferred that into what was
exactly.
happening.
Yeah, Claude McKay was another, right, a Jamaican immigrant, and a lot of them had been introduced to socialism back in the Caribbean, right? They had been politically active in their country, and many we see had traveled around to different Caribbean nations. So
Mm.
they developed something of a kind of pan-Africanist
Right.
perspective even before coming to the United States. Um, they're also coming from traditions where the church was not as sort of strongly ingrained in their culture, as it was in the United States, right? So some of them were just really shocked when they encountered American churches and when they encountered racism in American churches, right? So for some, maybe they weren't necessarily staunch atheists or agnostics when they got here, but they became free thinkers soon enough in their encounters with American racism.
And there was also something that you touched on briefly where you mentioned a little bit of a clash, a culture clash with some of those Caribbean folks coming up, and maybe due to the racism part or just a general culture clash. Can you talk a little bit just briefly on that? The fact that maybe I forgot who the person was, but there was one person who kind of didn't. Like you said, they kind of didn't identify too well with whatever was happening in the churches, and they felt that people were perhaps discriminating against them from being from somewhere else. So even within our own, groups, there was that culture clash. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this is something that would become more pronounced in the 1960s, right? I think is in 1965 we had an immigration act that sort of opened up a lot more opportunities for immigration from the Caribbean and African and Asian nations. So it become really pronounced then, but yeah, pretty early on in the 1920s and the 1930s, you certainly see sort of disagreements and cultural clashes between Caribbean migrants and African Americans, born within the United States. Um, Especially in the 1930s, you have competition for very scarce resources during the Great Depression. So there's competition over jobs and things like that, but also just sort of different cultural emphases and backgrounds, right? Like I mentioned, of course, the sort of strength of the Black church really being very shocking, I think, to some Caribbean migrants, especially some from like Jamaica, for example, which is still controlled by Britain, who might have been Anglicans in Jamaica, right? So,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
go to your 1 hour church service once a week, but it's not really a huge deal. And
Hmm.
Black religion is obviously very different from that in the United States. So it's sort of a beginning or an origin to, I think, what would become much stronger and more pronounced divisions between Blacks in the 1960s and 1970s with heavier immigration from the Caribbean.
Wow. I wonder if that has any link to, last week we had Andrew Seidel on, and he talked a lot about, his book is the Founding Fathers or the Founding Myth, and the composition of our religious landscape being so very heavily Protestant from the beginning was something that was a thread throughout. It created a competition, and it created a sense of just sort of endless uh, evolution of denominations. And to your point, if you're from a British Isle, a British island, where you have the Anglican Church primarily, there isn't a whole lot of competition. It's you just go to church, you're Christian, and you keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah,
Um,
so in countries like that with the state church, you actually see much less of an influence of religiosity, right?
right.
Where it's not, where it's kind of sort of mandated from above, and people sort of push back against that sort of forced religiosity. In the United States, it's not really forced. People are getting that chance to kind of choose what they want to do.
Right. I'm going to go to the chat real quick. Walter sends in something. He says he recently skimmed Stewart's biography of Alain Locke. I don't remember Stewart saying Locke was a free thinker. To what extent were people of the Harlem Renaissance explicitly free thinkers?
Yeah, so many of the Harlem Renaissance writers, and Locke was a free thinker, but he's one where I found evidence of his free thought in personal correspondence, right, in letters, dating back to his time at Harvard. He was the second Black graduate of Harvard after Du Bois. Um, and I found evidence of his secularism in personal correspondence, right, between him and his mother, where he's sort of castigating religion and kind of railing against it. Um, Many were more implicitly free thinkers. So, like Langston Hughes, for example, used poetry to critique religion, right? Song for a Dark Girl was one where he's talking about a lynching in the United States and uses that poem to sort of question whether God, it might be a racist, God might be on the side of those doing the lynchings. But you can see this is sort of a method where he can say, well, this is just a poem. It's not necessarily what I think. It's just an artistic production, right? Same thing with Nella Larson. Even though everybody knew Helga Crane was Nella Larson, everyone knew it was an autobiographical novel. Nevertheless, she could still say, this is a novel, right? This isn't a memoir about me. But again, with Nella Larson, I found kind of personal correspondence that kind of speaks um, that speaks to her free thought and her secularism. Now, later on in their lives, you start to get some of these Harlem Renaissance writers being more explicit, not necessarily during the time of the Renaissance, but a little bit later, right? So, Langston Hughes, The Big C, and Zora Neale Hurston, Dust Tracks on a Road, they both published their autobiographies in the early 1940s, well after the Harlem Renaissance had ended, right? A good 10 years after it had ended. Probably one of the few exceptions was Hubert Harrison, right? I wouldn't necessarily place him in the Harlem Renaissance, but in that socialist and communist movement, he was very open about his secularism in speeches that he gave throughout Harlem, as well as in publications in places in journals like the Truth Seeker, right? So he was fairly open about his secularism. Du Bois was he was a little more open in that he was publishing pretty strong critiques of the church in the Crisis magazine. So most were kind of implicit with it, but a few kind of let their thoughts be known a bit more. Locke wasn't one of those who was kind of going around trying to convert others to atheism or anything. For him, religion was sort of a highly personal thing, or non-religion, as it were, was sort of a highly personal thing. So he wasn't trying to like really spread his secular ideas.
Wow, that's amazing. let's just do two more questions. I have a question. Speaking of Hubert Harrison, and as I told you before, I was incredibly surprised and ashamed to learn that I had not learned about Hubert Harrison, who is where I'm from. I'm from St. Croix, and to hear of his migration and then his outspokenness and organization, and how in the book and how that influenced the Garveyite movement, and then how through the chain, the link that influenced the parents of Malcolm X, which would then influence Malcolm X language, which would then later on sort of be, kind of passed on down into eventually the civil rights and the Black Power movement. Can you talk about those links? In case I said it wrong, can you just talk a little bit about those links from him that sort of go throughout the civil rights movement?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Hubert Harrison, like a lot of these Caribbean immigrants, was kind of developed a Black internationalist perspective, a Pan Africanist perspective, where he saw sort of the fates and destinies of Black people around the world as linked, right? And so for him, it wasn't enough to just critique racism in the United States, but it was really his goal to build kind of international solidarity among Black peoples, right, to fight racism and colonialism all over the globe. Now, Hubert Harrison was close with Richard B. Moore, another atheist, communist Caribbean immigrant, right? They actually attended the same church in Harlem. Believe it or not, it was the Harlem Unitarian,
Tarian.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Very open to a range of religious or non-religious perspectives.
Right.
Um, this church had more of a kind of forum style service where you would have talks or debates on particular subjects. So it wasn't out of the ordinary for atheists to attend that church. And in fact, after Harrison's death in 1928, the Harlem Unitarian Church was renamed the Hubert H. Harrison Memorial Church.
Oh, wow.
In that church, Harrison would speak with Richard B. Moore, right, and would help to sort of inform his ideas. Now, Richard B. Moore would have sort of a long activist career within Harlem, and when I was doing research for the last chapter of the book and looking into Black Power and the rise of the Black Panther Party, I was actually reading through Stokely Carmichael's autobiography, Ready for Revolution.
Hmm.
And Carmichael talks about, I actually open up chapter 4 with this vignette about Carmichael, how he's living in the Bronx in the 1950s, right? He's living largely in a Jewish neighborhood, right? The Bronx is much whiter than it would be later on.
Hmm.
So there were a lot fewer Black people. He was in an area where he couldn't even find a good Black barber. So
Hmm.
he would travel down to Harlem, hang out with his cousin Inez, and get his haircuts at a barber shop in Harlem. And
Hmm.
while he was there, he would encounter a much older Richard B. Moore up on a step ladder or up on a milk crate or something, giving speeches, right?
Wow.
And Moore was, still a committed kind of communist and Pan-Africanist. And Carmichael says that, speakers like Queen Mother Audley Moore, one of the founders of the reparations movement,
Uh-huh.
speakers like these that he would encounter in Harlem really helped to shape his own kind of Pan-Africanist perspectives. So yeah, I mean, we see these links between these Black activists like Harrison in the 1910s, Richard Moore in the 1920s, some of whom are still alive, still giving speeches, still hanging out at the barber shops, or even just hanging out on the corner, kind of schooling the younger up and coming activists and secularists and helping to shape their perspectives that even now are still shaping the political ideology of people in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
Some folks now are going back to the writings of Black Panther Party activists and leaders and saying, oh yeah, they had some good ideas back then in the late 1960s.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly why I wanted to do this entire series, is sort of to bring that up to speed, and up to date, so we can reflect on the connections, because our problems are kind of the same problems. Like, we're
Yeah.
not really doing anything new. So it really is important that we understand the legacy that we have, but that we can also educate ourselves on what people were saying and the different dynamics that existed previously, and that can inform how we choose our strategies now. I want to
Yeah.
do one more question. Ralph says there's a biographer of Ralph Ellison, Rapper said, who said at a talk that Ellison insisted on a secular funeral, but this is not mentioned in the biography. Do you have any more information on this, on Ralph Ellison?
I do not. I have not really done any research on Ralph Ellison, although I probably should have. Um, but there are other people who could have been in the book, right?
Right.
There are folks like some Black Unitarians, right? Frances Ellen Watkins Harper could have probably been in the book. She attended sort of a Unitarian deist church in the late 19th century. And some others, but eventually at some point you're writing a 50-page chapter and you're just tired. You're like, okay, I'm done. So I thought about trying to look for more stuff on Ralph Ellison, but I felt like it would have made the chapter I was working on a little bit too unwieldy. So I really didn't look into it. But I'm not surprising that Ellison would have insisted on, or I'm not surprised that he would have insisted on a secular funeral because. Again and again, in both the Harlem Renaissance and in the Black arts movement, we see that some of the leading Black freethinkers are also writers, are intellectuals, right? And
Mhm.
it's like the form of literature, of novels, of poetry allows you a sort of creativity and flexibility in sort of expressing some of these ideas than maybe other kind of literary forms would, right? And writers are just people who are engaged in very solitary enterprises, right? I'm not a novelist or anything, but I write books and you're just alone a lot of the time. So it's not surprising that these are people that we see sort of overly represented among the free thought ranks. I'm glad you mentioned this, Ralph, and thank you for that. And I'm going to look into it a little bit more because I'm writing a second volume on Black free thought, and that's mainly going to look at the 1970s. Up through the present, but I'll have like probably one chapter offering some historical background. And in that chapter, I'm going to be trying to include stuff that I didn't write in Black Freethinkers Volume 1. So the history of Black free thought up through the civil rights movement, but trying to highlight some new thinkers and some maybe new trends that I didn't go into in this first book.
Speaking of that, right before we finish, I missed a question from Adisa who asked about Thurgood Marshall. Anything written about him that is relevant? I'm not sure if he is theist identified. I'm not sure if he identified
Yeah,
that way,
to
but is
my understanding, he was a theist.
okay.
So I didn't really look into him. I didn't find anything about his skepticism.
Okay. Sweet. Well, Christopher, this has been an amazing journey for us. Thank you for not just coming to the legacy session, but for opening and closing it. I really wanted to feature your work through this. It is really what grounded this summit and this project, which is to highlight this legacy that you've articulated in this book. The book is called Black Freethinkers, a history of African American secularism. You'll find the link in the chat. Everybody, you want to, if you want, just go ahead and grab that link. It's a Google document. I just put it in there one more time. Um, it's going to have pretty much whatever you want to find on Christopher in terms of his writings and where you can get the book. And I also want to just generally thank everybody who's come back to this session every week that we've done it since September. It's been a whole lot going on. We've got a presidential general election. We encourage everybody to go out and vote. We've got a pandemic that we're living through and surviving through. We've got a whole lot going on. But thank you for spending your Saturdays with us for the last 5 weeks. We've had some amazing talks and we've learned some amazing lessons. I hope that through this experience, you can feel a little bit more grounded in and assert yourself in your identity, or at least begin to just sort of look into some of these things a little bit more, so that when people talk about whether or not you are really a non-believer or not, as Chris said, that you can really feel like, no, I'm grounded in this, and it's not just me as an individual. Like, there is a long line of dissent in our communities, specifically as Black people, as women, as LGBT folks, as people from the United States, as people from outside the United States. We've been here, and that's the whole point of this conversation. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I want to thank Mandisa for co-hosting with me. She couldn't make it today, but I definitely am so thankful for her support, especially behind the scenes with this. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank the American Humanist Association for helping to underwrite this and make this possible. So thank you once again, Christopher, for your expertise and for sharing this information with us in general, but also here in this program. And we will see you on the other side. We won't have an after chat today, but we will definitely see you. And we hope that you continue to support Black Nonbelievers. You can go to the website, blacknonbelievers.com or blacknonbelievers.org, and you can find Black Nonbelievers of DC on Facebook, BN of DC, and you can check us out and follow us there. Thank you so much. All right, talk to you all later. Bye.